Imagine for a moment you are a young woman in the year 1272. The world smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoes through the village, and the whispers of the church bell dictate the rhythm of life. You have thoughts, dreams, perhaps even opinions. But what if those thoughts, those dreams, those opinions were not merely considered impolite, but dangerous? What if daring to speak your mind, to manage your household with shrewd efficiency, or to simply possess a sharp intellect could earn you a label that followed you like a shadow, a label designed to shame, control, and silence, a shrew? How did such a word come to wield such power, to crush the spirits of countless women in a time so far removed from our own? Number 10. Daring to dream of education beyond the convent walls. In the bustling, muddy lanes of a medieval town in 1272, where the scent of baking bread mingled with the stench of animal waste, the pursuit of knowledge was largely the domain of men. For women, especially those not destined for a life of piety within a convent, education was often limited to the practical skills necessary for running a household, managing servants, or perhaps spinning and weaving. The notion of a woman engrossed in texts, debating philosophy, or poring over ancient manuscripts was, for many, an affront to the natural order, a deviation from the divinely ordained path for her gender. When a woman dared to dream of an education that extended beyond basic literacy, perhaps even aspiring to understand the intricacies of law, the subtleties of theology, or the grand narratives of history, she was stepping onto forbidden ground, a territory jealously guarded by male scholars, monks, and clerks. Consider a scene in a wealthy merchant's house in Norwich, circa 1272. Young Alara, perhaps gifted with a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity, might have learned to read at her father's knee, a rare privilege. But her true passion lay not in tallying ledgers or supervising the kitchen staff, but in the illuminated manuscripts brought back by her father's trading ships, tales of faraway lands and forgotten wisdom. Her desire to learn Latin, to understand the sermons preached in the cathedral, or to engage with the weighty texts of scholastic thought, would have been met with a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. Her mother might gently chide her, reminding her of her duties, of the suitors who would seek a wife capable of managing a prosperous home, not one lost in dusty books. Father, while perhaps initially proud of her quick wit, would soon grow uneasy. What purpose could such learning serve a woman? It was not for her to interpret scripture, nor to argue legal precedents in a court of law. Such intellectual ambition was seen as unfitting, even dangerous, for it could lead to independence of thought, a quality actively discouraged in women. The established order of 1272 reinforced the idea that a woman's intellect, if acknowledged at all, should be directed towards spiritual devotion or domestic efficiency, never towards challenging the male monopoly on academic pursuits. Universities, burgeoning centers of learning like Oxford and Paris, were exclusively male enclaves, their lecture halls echoing with the debates of young men destined for the clergy, law, or royal service. A woman who sought to engage with such intellectual pursuits was not only defying societal norms, but also, in the eyes of many, disrupting the very hierarchy of creation. Her sharp questions, her insightful observations, might be dismissed as mere feminine chatter, or worse, as evidence of a troublesome spirit. Such a woman might be perceived as overstepping her bounds, as too bold, too assertive in her mental capabilities. Her intelligence, rather than being celebrated, became a source of discomfort for those around her, especially for men who felt their intellectual superiority threatened. The label of shrew was a convenient tool to dismiss such a woman. It implied that her intellectual aspirations were not a sign of genuine ability, but rather a manifestation of an unmanageable, nagging, or disruptive personality. If she argued a point with logical precision, she was not being rational, but simply shrewish and argumentative. If she devoured books, she was neglecting her proper duties, a sign of her willful nature. This intellectual assertiveness, this hunger for knowledge that transcended the prescribed boundaries for women, was seen as a challenge to the deeply ingrained belief that men were naturally superior in intellect and reason. It was a subtle, yet powerful, form of social control. By labeling an intelligent woman a shrew, society could diminish her accomplishments, invalidate her ideas, and ultimately discourage other women from daring to tread similar intellectual paths. The silent message was clear. A woman's mind was not meant for the grand contemplation of the world, but for the quiet management of her hearth and home. Any deviation, any intellectual spark that burned too brightly, risked being extinguished by the cold, dismissive word, shrew. Number 9, speaking her mind in public, from market square to manorial court. Imagine walking through a bustling market square in 1272. The air is thick with the cries of vendors, the bleating of sheep, and the murmur of conversations. Women are present, of course, buying and selling, haggling over prices, exchanging gossip. There is an unspoken rule, a subtle expectation that their voices, though heard, should not challenge, should not dominate, should not, in essence, assert themselves too strongly in the public sphere. For a woman to speak her mind, to voice her opinions assertively, particularly if those opinions challenged authority or conventional wisdom, was to invite scrutiny, disapproval, and often, the dreaded label of shrew. Consider a scene in a manorial court. This was not a grand courtroom of today, but often a simple hall where disputes were settled, petty crimes addressed, and the local lord's authority affirmed. A woman might be called upon to give testimony, perhaps concerning a boundary dispute, a theft, or a local rumor. While her presence was necessary, her voice was expected to be humble, deferential, and certainly not confrontational. If she spoke with too much conviction, if her arguments were too sharp, if she dared to interrupt or correct a male official, she was not being seen as a capable witness or a strong advocate for her own rights. Instead, her assertiveness was immediately pathologized, labeled as an inherent flaw in her character. She was scolding, contentious, or simply too loud, all precursors to the ultimate dismissal, a shrew. The very act of public speaking for women in 1272 was fraught with peril. A man could argue passionately, even loudly, in the village assembly or before a court, and be seen as strong or righteous. A woman doing the same risked being perceived as unruly, disorderly, and disruptive to the social order. Prevailing belief was that women were naturally more emotional, less rational than men. Therefore, any display of strong emotion, or indeed strong opinion, in public was not viewed as a sign of conviction, but as a lack of self-control, a failing of her feminine nature. Her voice, if it carried too much authority, was not seen as persuasive, but as nagging, hectoring, or domineering. Take the example of village life. Women often had to navigate complex social dynamics, from resolving quarrels among neighbors to overseeing household affairs with a firm hand. If a woman intervened in a dispute, perhaps to mediate or to defend a family member, and did so with confident speech and clear arguments, her assertiveness could easily be misconstrued. Instead of being praised for her wisdom or peacemaking efforts, she might be whispered about, her strong personality deemed a sign of her unruly spirit. She has a tongue sharper than any knife, someone might remark, or her husband must be a saint to tolerate such a voice. These casual comments, seemingly innocuous, slowly built a reputation, hardening into the damning label of a shrew. Moreover, the power structures of the time, rooted in a patriarchal system, actively discouraged female voices in public decision-making. Church preached female submission, and secular laws often curtailed women's legal agency. When a woman asserted herself verbally in a public forum, she was not just expressing an opinion, she was implicitly challenging the established order that relegated her to a quieter, more private sphere. Her words, no matter how logical or well-reasoned, were seen as an encroachment upon male authority, a usurpation of roles not meant for her. This challenge, often subconscious on the woman's part, was met with a protective backlash from society. The shrew label was a convenient way to neutralize this perceived threat, to discredit her words, and by extension, to reinforce the prevailing norms of female silence and submission. It was a powerful silencing mechanism, ensuring that the public stage remained largely a male domain, where women's voices, when heard, were ideally soft, submissive, and never, ever too assertive. Number 8, attempting to manage her own finances and property. In the year 1272, the economic landscape of medieval Europe was tightly interwoven with family structures and gender roles. For a woman, particularly a married woman, attempting to manage her own finances or property independently of her husband was akin to navigating a minefield blindfolded. It was a radical act that directly challenged the deeply entrenched legal and social systems designed to place economic power firmly in the hands of men. When a woman exhibited a knack for business, an astute understanding of markets, or a fierce protectiveness of her family's land and money, she was not often praised for her acumen. Instead, her assertiveness in this male-dominated sphere frequently earned her the scornful label of shrew. Consider a woman, let us call her Agnes, a merchant's wife in a bustling port town like Southampton in 1272. Her husband, perhaps often away on trading voyages, might entrust her with the day-to-day running of their household accounts, buying provisions, or even overseeing minor transactions in his absence. This level of management was often tolerated, even expected. But what if Agnes, through her own intelligence and initiative, began to expand these responsibilities? What if she started making independent investments, negotiating contracts with suppliers, or even buying and selling small properties in her own name, or rather in the name of the family, but largely through her own judgment? This would quickly raise eyebrows. The legal concept of coverture was a powerful force in medieval England. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was effectively subsumed by that of her husband. She could not typically own property in her own right, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued without her husband's involvement. Her earnings, if she had any, were legally his. While customary law varied, and some urban centers granted married women more rights in trade, the prevailing norm was male financial control. Therefore, a woman who demonstrated assertiveness in financial matters was seen as defying not just social convention, but legal precedent. She was usurping her husband's role, diminishing his authority, and disrupting the established order of the household economy. The social implications were equally severe. A man's honor and status were often tied to his ability to provide for and control his household. His wife was seen to be managing their finances with too much autonomy, especially if she was perceived as more capable or successful than he. It could be interpreted as a sign of his weakness, his inability to control his own wife. Such a man might become the subject of ridicule, and his wife, Agnes, would be branded a shrew. Financial shrewdness, which in a man would be celebrated as good business sense, was in her seen as an aggressive, unfeminine trait. She was wearing the breeches, as the saying would later go, metaphorically stepping into the masculine role of head of household and financial decision-maker. Even widows, who legally regained much of their autonomy after their husband's death, faced scrutiny if they managed their inherited lands or businesses with too much vigor. A widow who effectively ran a large estate, commanded tenants, and made shrewd financial decisions might be admired for her capability by some, but others would inevitably view her as too independent, too powerful, too much like a man. The label of shrew served as a convenient way to cut her down to size, to undermine her authority, and to remind society that even a woman with legal autonomy was still expected to conform to certain behavioral norms. Her assertiveness in protecting her dower rights, for example, or in prosecuting a tenant for unpaid rents, could be twisted into evidence of her quarrelsome or nagging nature, rather than her rightful pursuit of justice and financial security. The underlying message was clear. Women's economic roles were to be subservient and contained within the domestic sphere, and any assertive step beyond those boundaries was met with social condemnation and the damning accusation of being a shrew. Number 7. Rejecting an arranged marriage or seeking a divorce. In the meticulously structured society of 1272, marriage was rarely a matter of individual romantic choice. It was first and foremost a powerful tool for forging alliances, consolidating land, securing economic stability, and producing legitimate heirs. For a woman, especially one of noble or wealthy merchant stock, her marriage was a critical transaction, negotiated by her family for the benefit of their lineage and status. To reject an arranged marriage, or even to contemplate seeking a divorce in an era when it was almost impossible, was an act of profound defiance, a direct assault on the very foundations of social order. Such an assertive stance by a woman was almost guaranteed to earn her the reputation of a shrew, a disobedient and troublesome female. Imagine young Lady Isolde, whose family in 1272 had arranged a match with a neighboring lord twice her age, known for his harsh temper and dwindling lands. Isolde, perhaps possessing a stronger will than her demure appearance suggested, might resist. She might voice her displeasure, weep openly, or even, in a moment of desperate bravery, refuse to give her consent before the priest. While church law technically required the free consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid, the social pressure to comply was immense, especially for a woman. Her refusal would not be seen as a courageous act of self-determination, but as stubbornness, rebellion, and a profound disrespect for her family's wishes and her own future. She would be branded as unmanageable, willful, and most certainly a shrew. Her assertiveness in seeking control over her own destiny, over the most important decision of her life, was viewed as a dangerous challenge to patriarchal authority. Seeking a divorce, on the other hand, was an even more audacious and near impossible feat. 1272, true divorce as we understand it, allowing remarriage, was almost non-existent under church law. What existed were annulments, granted on very specific limited grounds such as consanguinity, being too closely related, pre-existing vows, or non-consummation. Initiating such a process, especially by a woman, was an incredibly complex and publicly scandalous undertaking. It required challenging deeply held religious beliefs about the sanctity of marriage, and it exposed deeply personal details to the harsh scrutiny of ecclesiastical courts. Consider a woman, perhaps a leaner, who finds herself in an abusive or barren marriage. If she dared to seek an annulment, even with legitimate grounds, she would be seen as overtly assertive, as challenging the social contract of marriage, and as disrupting the peace and order of her household and community. Plight, no matter how dire, would often be overshadowed by the perception that she was being difficult, demanding, or refusing to accept her lot in life. Male-dominated courts would view her with suspicion. Her insistence on escaping her circumstances, her assertive pursuit of a different future, would not be interpreted as a plea for justice, but as a demonstration of her unruly nature. She was seeking to undo what God had joined, disrupting her husband's peace, or worse, showing a rebellious spirit. The label of shrew served to delegitimize her grievances, to paint her as the problem, rather than the victim or the agent of her own liberation. Her assertive rejection of a predetermined life path or her bold attempt to escape an unbearable one was simply unacceptable within the rigid social framework of 1272, and the shrew label was society's weapon to punish her for daring to assert such profound personal autonomy. Number 6. Practicing healing arts without male supervision. In the high Middle Ages of 1272, the healing arts were a complex blend of traditional knowledge, burgeoning scientific understanding, and deep-seated superstition. For centuries, women had been the primary caregivers within the home and village, acting as midwives, herbalists, and folk healers. They possessed invaluable knowledge passed down through generations, often cultivating herb gardens and concocting remedies for common ailments. However, as the era progressed, a more formal male-dominated medical profession began to emerge, often linked to the universities and the church. When a woman practiced healing arts with too much confidence, too much success, or too much independence from male oversight, she risked being labeled not merely as skilled, but as dangerous, unconventional, and ultimately a shrew. Imagine a woman like Martha, living in a small rural village in 1272. She is known throughout the community for her ability to ease fevers with specific poultices, to assist women in childbirth with calm expertise, and to set broken bones with surprising dexterity. Her knowledge is born of experience and observation, her reputation built on years of successful interventions. For many, she is a blessing, a source of comfort and practical aid. But her growing influence, her direct access to the intimate health details of families, and her undeniable competence could also breed suspicion among those who adhered to more conventional, male-centric views of authority and knowledge. As physicians, surgeons, and barbers began to professionalize in urban centers, often gaining legitimacy through university training, they viewed independent female healers with a mixture of disdain and fear. These male practitioners, backed by institutional power, often saw women like Martha as untrained, superstitious, or even worse, as potential threats to their nascent monopolies. Martha's remedies were more effective than those prescribed by a traveling male physician, or if she dared to question a diagnosis made by a man of learning, her assertiveness was not seen as evidence of her superior knowledge. Instead, it was twisted into a sign of her impudence, her defiance of male authority. She was meddling, presumptuous, or too forward for her gender. Moreover, the line between folk healing and witchcraft was, in the medieval mind, often terrifyingly thin. If a woman's cures were remarkably effective, or if her methods seemed unconventional to the uninitiated, she might be accused of using unnatural means. Her assertive pronouncements about a patient's condition, her confident application of remedies, could be interpreted not as professional competence, but as a sign of unholy power. The shrew label could easily segue into accusations of sorcery or heresy, particularly if she challenged the authority of the church or its approved healer. A woman who possessed too much knowledge, too much skill, or too much confidence in her healing abilities was seen as transgressing the boundaries of what was deemed appropriate for her sex. She was not just healing, she was asserting a dangerous form of power that lay outside male control. The shrew label in this context was a way to disempower her, to undermine her credibility, and to push her back into a more subservient role. Competence, her assertive command of medical knowledge, was reframed as nagging, bossy, or even evil. By associating her healing skills with a troublesome personality, society could dismiss her valuable contributions and reinforce the idea that women's roles were best confined to passive caregiving, rather than active, assertive medical practice. Fear was that her independence in healing could lead to independence in other spheres, ultimately disrupting the established social order and challenging the emerging male monopoly on the medical profession. Number 5, daring to defend herself physically or legally. Life in 1272 was often brutal and unpredictable. Disputes over land, property, or honor could escalate quickly, and justice, though sought, was not always easily obtained. For men, defending oneself, whether physically in a brawl or legally in a manorial court, was a recognized, even expected, aspect of upholding one's rights and reputation. For women, however, the landscape was entirely different. Women were expected to be meek, submissive, and to rely on male protection. When a woman dared to defend herself, either physically from assault or legally through asserting her rights, she was often seen as stepping far outside the bounds of appropriate feminine behavior. Such an assertive stance, challenging the notion of female vulnerability, was frequently met with the damning label of shrew. Consider a scenario in a bustling village, where a woman, perhaps a widow managing her late husband's meager holdings, finds her property encroached upon by a more powerful neighbor. Her usual recourse would be to appeal to male relatives, the local lord, or the church. But what if she, lacking immediate male protection or possessing a fierce sense of justice, decided to stand her ground? If she physically intervened to prevent the theft of her livestock, perhaps pushing away an aggressor or shouting a fierce defense, her actions would be scrutinized. While a man might be lauded for protecting his property, a woman doing the same might be condemned. Physical assertiveness would be seen as unwomanly, a sign of her unruliness rather than her courage. She was too strong, too bold, or fighting like a man, all preludes to the shrew accusation. The very act of protecting her own body or property, without deferring to a male protector, was a violation of the expectation that women were to be passive and reliant. The legal arena presented similar challenges. While women could bring certain cases to court, such as those related to dower rights or personal injury, their ability to assert themselves effectively was constrained by societal expectation. A woman who confidently articulated her case, cross-examined a witness, or challenged a legal precedent was not seen as a shrewd litigant. Instead, her articulate and assertive defense would be twisted into evidence of her disagreeable nature. Persistence would be labeled nagging, her logical arguments contentious, and her insistence on justice as simply being difficult. She was too loud, too demanding, or acting like a man, all justifications for the shrew label. The purpose of this label was clear: to undermine her credibility, dismiss her arguments, and ultimately discourage her from pursuing legal recourse independently. Underlying societal fear was that if women were allowed to assert themselves physically or legally, the entire patriarchal structure could begin to unravel. If a woman could defend herself, what need had she for a husband or a male guardian? If she could argue her case in court, what need had she for male legal representation? The shrew label served as a powerful deterrent, an implicit warning to all women that stepping outside the bounds of expected docility and reliance on male protection would come with severe social costs. It highlighted the perception that her assertiveness was not a sign of strength or agency, but rather a flaw in her character, an unwomanly trait that made her a social outcast, dangerous and undesirable. In a world where order was paramount, a woman who dared to assert her right to self-preservation, either with her body or her voice in court, was a disruptive force, and the shrew label was society's way of taming her. Number 4, challenging church authority or expressing unorthodox religious views. 1272, the church was arguably the most pervasive and powerful institution in medieval Europe, shaping every aspect of life from birth to death, from the laws of the land to the rhythms of daily existence. Doctrines on morality, gender roles, and the path to salvation were absolute. For a woman challenging church authority or expressing religious views that deviated from accepted orthodoxy was not merely an act of assertiveness. It was an act of profound spiritual rebellion, fraught with immense danger. Such a woman, often passionate and intellectually engaged with her faith, would inevitably be seen as a disruptive force, labeled not just a shrew, but potentially a heretic or even worse, a witch. Consider a woman deeply devoted to her faith, perhaps inspired by the burgeoning mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans, which emphasized personal piety and spiritual poverty. She might feel a calling to interpret scripture for herself, to preach, or to share her spiritual insights with others. In a male-dominated clergy, where preaching was an exclusive privilege of ordained men, a woman who dared to speak publicly on matters of faith was seen as usurping a sacred role. Her spiritual assertiveness, her conviction in her own understanding of God's word, would not be interpreted as piety or divine inspiration. Instead, it would be viewed as dangerous presumption, a sign of her uncontrolled will and potentially her susceptibility to demonic influence. She was too zealous, too vocal, or stepping beyond her station, all precursors to the dreaded shrew accusation. The Church's teachings reinforced the idea that women were spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, and thus required strict guidance from male authority. Any woman who demonstrated intellectual or spiritual independence, who dared to question a priest's interpretation, or who formed her own prayer groups outside sanctioned structures, was seen as undermining this order. Her fervor, if it led her to speak out against perceived corruption within the Church, or to advocate for a more direct, unmediated relationship with God, would be deemed rebellious and heretical. The authorities, ever vigilant against deviation, would quickly move to silence her. Take the example of the Beguines, communities of pious laywomen that flourished in some parts of Europe during this period. While many were tolerated, even admired, their independent spiritual lives, their communal living without formal vows or male oversight, often made them objects of suspicion. A Beguine who was particularly articulate, who challenged common misconceptions about women's spiritual capacities, or who openly criticized clerical shortcomings, would undoubtedly acquire a reputation for being shrewish. Her spiritual assertiveness, her refusal to conform to a prescribed, submissive role, was interpreted as a sign of her unruly nature rather than her deep faith. The accusation of shrew served to diminish her spiritual authority, to discredit her message, and to warn other women against similar independent religious pursuits. Ultimately, challenging church authority, even through acts of profound personal faith, was an act of extreme assertiveness that directly threatened the dominant power structure of 1272. The shrew label in this context was not just about social disapproval. It was a potent weapon wielded to silence and control women who dared to think for themselves in matters of faith, to prevent them from becoming leaders, prophets, or even simply independent voices that might inspire others to question the established order. It ensured that women's spiritual paths, if they were to be deemed acceptable, remained firmly within the confines of male guidance and control. Number 3, engaging in trade or business beyond domestic production. In the year 1272, the economy of medieval society, while growing in complexity, was largely defined by established gender roles. Women were primarily responsible for domestic production, spinning, weaving, baking for the household, perhaps tending a small garden or a few chickens. While many women participated in local markets, selling surplus produce or goods they had made, engaging in large-scale trade, or managing a substantial business enterprise independently was largely the domain of men. When a woman asserted herself in the bustling world of commerce, venturing beyond the familiar confines of domestic production into the wider marketplace, she was challenging economic norms and, more often than not, earned herself the label of shrew. Consider a woman like Johanna, living in a thriving mercantile town in 1272. Perhaps she inherited a small weaving business from her father, or her husband, a textile merchant, became ill. Johanna might possess a keen mind for numbers, an astute understanding of supply and demand, and a formidable ability to negotiate prices. She might successfully manage the weavers, source raw materials, and sell finished goods to customers, making a profit that supports her family and even expands the business. In a man, such qualities would be celebrated as good business sense, shrewdness, and industry. In Johanna, however, they would be viewed with suspicion. Her assertiveness in the marketplace, her confident haggling with suppliers, her firm dealings with customers, her strategic decisions about production and sales would be interpreted as unfeminine. A woman who commanded such respect in commercial dealings was seen as too bold, too outspoken, or too pushy. She was stepping outside the expected feminine role of being an aide to her husband or a quiet domestic producer. Active participation in the public sphere of trade, where men typically held sway, was perceived as an encroachment on their territory. The accusation of shrew served to diminish her competence, framing her business acumen not as intelligence, but as a disagreeable personality trait. Even women who ran established businesses, like alewives who brewed and sold beer from their homes, faced scrutiny if they became too prominent or too successful. While brewing was a common female occupation, a woman who expanded her operation, who became a major supplier, or who asserted herself too forcefully against competitors might find herself subjected to whispers and accusations. Entrepreneurial spirit and her assertive drive to succeed would be viewed as a negative attribute, a sign of her overbearing nature rather than her skill. She was too demanding, too ambitious, or too strong-willed for a woman, all leading to the shrew label. Underlying societal fear was that if women gained too much economic independence, it would disrupt the established patriarchal order. A woman who could support herself, or even her entire family, through her own business acumen might not need a man in the same way. This threatened the traditional family structure and male authority within it. The shrew label served as a powerful social sanction, a means to control and discourage women from pursuing economic power independently. It was a way to ensure that women's engagement in the marketplace remained largely subservient, limited to roles that supported male enterprises, or confined to a scale that did not challenge the prevailing male dominance in commerce. By branding her assertiveness in business as shrewish, society could dismiss her achievements, undermine her authority, and maintain the economic status quo, keeping women firmly in their prescribed, economically dependent place. Number 2, expressing unconventional views on sexuality or marriage. In the tightly structured moral and social landscape of 1272, female sexuality was a heavily regulated commodity. It was primarily seen in relation to marriage and procreation, essential for producing legitimate heirs and maintaining family lineage. Virginity before marriage, fidelity within marriage, and modesty at all times were not just ideals but rigid expectations, enforced by both church doctrine and societal pressure. For a woman to express unconventional views on sexuality, to assert her own desires, or to challenge the prevailing norms of modesty and marital roles, was to commit a profound transgression. Such assertiveness, seen as a dangerous subversion of moral order, almost invariably earned her the damning label of shrew. Consider a woman, perhaps a young widow named Julian, who, having experienced the constraints of an arranged marriage, decided she would not remarry simply for societal approval or economic necessity. She might perhaps have a secret affection for a man outside the bounds of conventional courtship, or she might simply desire a life of independent choice regarding her body and affections. If she spoke of such desires, if she dared to hint at a belief that love should be a factor in marriage, or if she simply refused to conform to the expectations of her marriage, she would be seen as deviant. Her assertiveness in claiming agency over her own body and romantic life was an unthinkable challenge to the patriarchal control over female sexuality. She would be deemed wanton, loose, or unvirtuous, and her independence of thought in such matters would quickly be twisted into the shrew label. Church, a dominant moral authority in 1272, preached extensively on sin and the dangers of female temptation. Any expression of female sexual agency that deviated from the narrow path of sanctioned procreation within marriage was viewed as sinful and scandalous. If a woman expressed a desire for sexual satisfaction, or if she challenged the idea that women were inherently more lustful and therefore needed strict male control, her assertiveness was not seen as a natural human desire, but as a sign of her fallen nature, her unruly passions. She was immodest, bold, or unashamed, all terms that easily morphed into the accusation of shrew. Her strong will in personal matters of the heart and body was interpreted as a sign of moral depravity and an inability to be properly controlled by men. Moreover, a woman who dared to criticize the roles within marriage, perhaps arguing for more equal partnership, or questioning the absolute authority of a husband, was also treading on dangerous ground. While some medieval literary traditions explored themes of courtly love and female agency, in daily life, the expectation was clear. The wife was to be obedient and submissive to her husband. A woman voiced opinions that challenged this hierarchy, perhaps asserting her right to make decisions alongside her husband or to be treated with greater respect. Her assertiveness would be seen as an act of rebellion. She was disobedient, domineering, or wearing the breeches, all accusations that painted her as a shrew. The shrew label in this context served as a powerful mechanism of social control, designed to enforce strict conformity to gendered sexual and marital norms. Punished women for daring to assert any autonomy over their own bodies, desires, or relationships. By branding her as a shrew, society could dismiss her views as the irrational ravings of an unruly woman, rather than legitimate expressions of personal agency or critiques of an unjust system. It ensured that female sexuality remained firmly within the confines of male, defined morality and marital structures, crushing any flicker of independent thought or desire that might challenge the rigid social order of 1272. Number 1, simply being intelligent and competent. Perhaps the most insidious reason a woman in 1272 might be labeled a shrew was not for any specific action, but for the mere possession and display of natural intelligence and competence. While it might seem paradoxical, simply being too smart, too capable, or too effective in any sphere could, in a patriarchal society, be perceived as a threat. Prevailing worldview in the High Middle Ages often held that women were inherently less rational, more emotional, and intellectually inferior to men. Therefore, a woman who defied these deeply ingrained stereotypes by her sheer brilliance or her undeniable efficacy was an anomaly, and anomalies often inspire fear, suspicion, and a need for control. Imagine a woman, let us call her Matilda, who, through no conscious effort to defy norms, simply possessed a sharp mind. She might grasp complex household accounts faster than her husband, offer insightful solutions to village disputes that eluded the local reeve, or manage her domestic staff with an efficiency that made other wives appear disorganized. Her natural aptitude, her ability to lead, to solve problems, and to think critically would not necessarily be celebrated as virtue. Instead, these qualities, when exhibited by a woman, could become a source of profound discomfort for the men and even some women around her. Her intelligence, if it outshone that of her husband, brothers, or male peers, could be perceived as a direct challenge to their masculinity and authority. A man whose wife was clearly more intelligent or capable than he might feel emasculated, his social standing potentially undermined. Rather than acknowledging her gifts, it was far easier and more socially acceptable to dismiss them, or rather, to reframe them as negative traits. Wit might be called sharp-tongued, her efficient management domineering, and her logical reasoning argumentative. Competence, instead of inspiring admiration, would be twisted into evidence of her disagreeable personality, her shrewishness. The shrew label, in this ultimate sense, became a blanket term for any woman who simply did not fit the mold of quiet, docile, and subservient. It was a catch-all accusation for those who were too observant, too articulate, too decisive, or too effective. Her very existence as an intelligent and competent individual, operating within a society that expected less of her intellectually, was a subtle form of assertiveness. She asserted, simply by being herself, that women could be rational, could be capable, could lead. This quiet defiance of established gender roles, this innate ability that transcended societal limitations, was a powerful threat. The label served as a convenient way to neutralize this threat without having to directly confront the uncomfortable truth of female capability. Calling her a shrew, society could avoid admitting that she was intelligent, competent, or even superior in certain skills. Instead, her admirable qualities were reframed as defects of character, making her an undesirable associate, a troublesome wife, or an insufferable neighbor. It was a social mechanism designed to keep women in their place, to discourage any display of intellectual or practical superiority that might challenge the male monopoly on power, knowledge, and leadership. 1272, to simply be an intelligent and competent woman was, paradoxically, one of the surest ways to be branded with the scornful, silencing label, shrew.